Today we are going to be talking about refreshing terms, some terms that we should really know. And if we don't know, this is what the refresher is for. And we're actually going to extend on some definition of these terms as we get into sophomore year. So, as I talked about previously, one of the things that we do throughout the poetry unit is to kind of learn these terms, and we're always going to learn a term paired with a poem, so we have a little bit of something to grasp onto. And I would suggest that you actually make a document for notes, and you kind of take notes as you're listening to these things. You can copy and paste poems into those notes, and you can make copies onto those notes. I'm a big fan of making notes onto those papers, and usually I hand you a paper of every single poem when we go through the poetry unit. Obviously, this year we're not able to do that either in class or virtually. So, making your own document for notes specifically for poetry, and whether you do that each day or one a week, or whether you put them all in the same place, make sure you're copying and pasting the poems out of Canvas so that you're able to interact with those poems and kind of use them a little bit. And that's why I'm here to kind of show you a few things. So literary terms that are really important. Let's go ahead and look at them, and then we'll look at how they're used inside of our poem this week. So the first big term to know is figurative language. And this is how we refer to literary terms. We refer to them as figurative language. So you have two things that mean the same thing: literary terms and figurative language. Figurative language refers to the abstract. So this is one of the reasons that people really struggle with poetry specifically, is poetry lives in the world of the abstract, as opposed to the world of the literal, right? When we live in the world of the literal, then what we look at means the thing that we're looking at, right? A stop sign means stop. It says stop on it. It's a physical object that you can touch. And yet, there's a lot of figurative language around the idea of a stop sign, right? It is also a symbol. It's a hexagon. So even if you're colorblind, you're able to recognize the shape, right? That's a symbolic thing. If you're not colorblind, it's red, and we associate red with stop in our culture. And so something as simple as a stop sign has both literal language and figurative language. Figurative language really gets to a deeper meaning than the everyday, right? And so while we could say, I feel this way, right? It's much more artful and much more interesting to portray our feelings through something like metaphor. So let's go ahead and get into all of the terms that we use, by the way, are called figurative language. This is a big umbrella term. So metaphor, we know it very simply as a comparison without using like or as. But the real reason that we want to use metaphor as opposed to simile, which we'll talk about in a minute, is that because we aren't directing our audience to think about the comparison is a little more subconscious. It's less obvious to the reader that a comparison is being made, and therefore the comparison is stronger. So we say love is like a rose, right? It has its beauty and its thorns. That's a simile. Love is like a rose. I'm being very obvious in how I'm comparing those things. But if I want to go with the metaphor, love will seduce you with its aroma, but just as likely cut you with its thorns. I'm not being intentional about the comparison that's being made, and therefore we get a stronger literary term, right? A stronger use of figurative language. So that's one of the key things that I really want you to know about metaphor this year. Not just that it's like a simile, but it doesn't use like or as, but that lack of using like or as actually creates a more powerful connection for us. An extended metaphor. So we have different kinds of metaphors. An extended metaphor, sometimes we also have extended similes. They're really the same thing. Is where the whole poem is really about one thought. The whole poem can be referred back to as a singular metaphor. And we're actually going to see an example of that when we look at Langston Hughes's Harlem. An implied metaphor. So if a metaphor is a comparison, the implied metaphor doesn't have one of the comparison points. And so here we get an example. A woman barked a warning at her child. Well, what are we comparing the woman to? We're comparing the woman to a dog because of the bark, right? So you would want to use a different word if you didn't want to compare a woman to a dog in this case. And that's a good example of an implied metaphor where we don't have the other side, and we as human beings have to fill in, well, what's that being compared to? Just for the sake of review, right, simile does use like or as to make that comparison. And as I just said, it's weaker when we compare it to metaphor because it does announce itself. And just to throw this in here, we'll be working with analogy a lot, but analogy is another comparison term. And unlike a simile or a metaphor, it compares the relationship between two things. So if you ever did analogy exercises, we might say dog is to puppy as cat is to kitten. Well, what we're really comparing is the adult to the child there, right? So when we do an analogy, we're trying to set up a circumstance where we understand relationship. We as teachers really use analogies pretty often to try to parallel an example to help you as students understand a concept, because most concepts are about relational as opposed to being literal, right? So that's our series of terms for this week. And when you're doing your reference list, you want to be on the lookout. Does my poem that I selected have metaphor? High chance of usage of metaphor in almost every poem. Does it have a simile? Is it an extended metaphor? This is where you're going to get to hit and miss, right? Some of your poems might be an extended metaphor, but certainly not all of them are going to be extended metaphor. So now that we've talked a little bit about it, let's go ahead and encounter how we're going to be doing that in class. So you've noticed that I've set aside like for Wednesday, here are the poems that we're encountering. I encourage you to read Lanyard by Langston or by Billy Collins because it's a really fun poem. This is kind of an introduction that I would do with most classes, and I'm going to use this in class to talk. But if we look at Harlem by Langston Hughes, this is the poem that we're really going to evaluate. So a very short poem, Harlem by Langston Hughes, and it reads, "What happens to a dream deferred? Does it dry up like a raisin in the sun, or fester like a sore and then run? Does it stink like rotten meat, or crust and sugar over like a syrupy sweet? Maybe it just sags like a heavy load, or does it explode?" And so what I want you to do, again, is you're taking notes. I want you to copy and paste this poem into your notes. I want you to pause the video and see, can I identify where metaphor and simile, extended metaphor, implied metaphor, analogy, are they all in this poem? Are only some of them in this poem? Can you highlight some of those terms and make a comment before I review the poem? So please pause your video and do that work now. And I'm going to go ahead and assume that you did all that work and that you've unpaused me. And so let's go ahead and look through the poem. Well, first off, we're going to probably notice that a dream deferred is an extended metaphor, right? We're actually connecting the dream deferred to all of these examples. In this case, it also happens to be an analogy, right? What happens to a dream deferred? Well, the relationship is like a fester and a sore. So what's a fester and a sore? Well, that's where you're becoming infected, right? So what happens when you put off a dream? It's like you become infected, or it becomes like a raisin in the sun. It dries up, right? Or it becomes like rotten meat and it ruins itself, right? So pretty complicated because we're using all of these terms almost immediately. Each individual one is an analogy. The whole poem is an extended metaphor. And inside, I bet this is the one we picked up on, does it dry up like, here's a simile. right? Does it stink? Like. Here's a simile. Does it crust over? Like. Here's a simile, right? So we probably definitely noticed the similes. I would hope that we noticed all those likes. And then maybe we recognize this entire thing as an extended metaphor. Maybe we recognize that each one of these is also an analogy. Pretty complex poem. So what is it referring to, right? Well, the dream, is this like an American dream, like something that we aspire to? What happens when we have inspiration and we leave it too long and we don't apply ourselves to that inspiration? Does it do all of these things? Does it cause us pain and hurt and eventually maybe anger? That's one way to read this poem. However, if we know much about Langston Hughes, we know that he was a poet during the Harlem Renaissance, a time period of kind of rebirth of the black culture, specifically in Harlem, and a political and cultural movement that said our equality is not being met, right? Our government has promised us equality for 60 years now since the Civil War, and nothing has changed outside of our freedom. And that's not enough. It's time for us to reach the dream of equality, right? And so definitely if you understand that dream of equality, then this poem takes on a different meaning, right? So sometimes understanding the actual circumstances around a poem are key to really understanding it. And we'll get into all these theories and things like that. Harlem is one of these poems that I like because it kind of does have a right answer, but it also has a reader's answer, right? That if you have a specific dream, you can kind of understand what Langston Hughes' dream is. However, if you understand that you are not treated equally in society, then you really understand what Langston Hughes is talking about. Hopefully this is a nice introduction into how we're going to break down poems. There's a lot of complexity. I know I'm doing a lot of talking to you because we can't interact in this way. So that means that when we do attend class, we have to interact a lot, right? And keep me from talking too much and kind of get directly into the purpose of understanding these poems.